Hi there, my name's Damien. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to look at a demonstration involving a Power Automate Cloudflow that will save attachments from your emails to a custom folder or site based on the subject line of the email or the attachment file name. So I can think of two scenarios where this might be useful. We have a works center, a Xerox work center at work, funnily enough, and we can send emails to ourselves based on the files that we've scanned at that work center. And so we can include a subject, and if we include a keyword in that subject, we could get the Cloudflow to automatically file that file away into a particular folder or SharePoint site based on parameters that we save within that Cloudflow. Another example might be you have your customers email you in an attachment, and again, using a specific subject, you want the Power Automate to pick up that file and save it into one of your document libraries, a specific folder, or maybe a specific site. So you're taking away that manual task, the administrative burden of having to sift through emails and saving attachments to your SharePoint folder or site. So let's jump on to the demonstration. So here I am already in my Cloudflow, and I will walk you through the various stages of this flow. I've got 3 demonstrations within this one flow. I'll create a file in a bespoke path based on the subject line. I will create a file in a bespoke site based on the subject line. And then finally, I'll save the file based on the attachment name rather than the subject. Like I say, I've got these all in one Cloudflow. You would choose one of the following 3 options, or potentially you might use a couple, depending on how many copies of the file you want to create. But one copy of the truth, that's the norm now for SharePoint, so let's just save it into one place to keep things simple. If I jump onto my SharePoint sites that I've built, I have a new site here, and in that document library within my new site, I have 3 folders: the Finance, the HR, and the ICT folder. And so this is where potentially I will be looking at that subject line within the email and saving a file to either the Finance, the HR, or the ICT folder. I have an HR site, which you can see again here in the URL, and I'm in the default document library. And this is where I'm going to use my flow to save a file into the HR SharePoint site rather than my default new site. And then finally, I've got also got, similar to the HR site, I've got a site called ICT. So that's a separate SharePoint site, and I'm actually going to use this site to save a file based on the file name rather than the subject. I've got my Outlook mailbox open up here, and I've also got a secondary mailbox that I'm going to send my attachment from. And the reason I'm using a secondary mailbox, it was to try and simulate a workstation. So if you were sending attachments from your Xerox, it would presumably come from a single point of contact, and I've used that as part of my trigger, so that when I'm looking for the new emails that are being received to my inbox, they're coming from a specific address. And you can see that here in the trigger, in the advanced options. I am going to put in Xerox as my from address for this particular action, and that means that this trigger is only going to fire when emails come from the Xerox username. And I've also, as you noticed here, changed include attachments to yes. So that's just to limit this flow and the number of times it runs based on the following criteria. So I'll go ahead and save that, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring up my secondary inbox. But before I do that, let's just put this into test mode, so it's sitting waiting to run. and I'll jump into my mailbox. So this is my Xerox mailbox. I'm going to create a new message. I'm going to send that email to myself, and I've got a file here, and you'll see in the file name has ICT in the name. But what I'm going to do is here, the subject line is going to say this is for HR. So remember, my demonstration is to act on either the subject line or the file name. And I've got 3 different scenarios within that one cloud flow. So I'd expect this file to be saved in the HR folder or the HR site for the first and second parts of my flow. For the third part of the flow, it's going to use the file name and it will save the file into the ICT folder. Or site, in fact, I think maybe that's what I've used. So it doesn't really matter what the content of the email is here. I'm going to say hello and I'm going to hit send, and then I'm going to jump back to my cloud flow. So we'll note now that the cloud flow has launched. And delay, let's go and have a look at the bespoke path. So if you remember, we're going to save this to the HR folder. So I'm sitting now in the HR folder of my new site. And when this new file appears, there it is. File name has ICT in it, but it noticed the HR within the subject line. The next part is to look at the bespoke site. So I'll jump into HR quickly. And we should in a minute get a file appear here in our HR site. Here we go, in our HR site. And then the final part is to save based on the attachment name. So I actually need to jump back here into Documents and into ICT, because it's now going to save into the ICT folder based on the file name. So there we go, picked up ICT, it saved it as planned into the ICT folder. How did that work? So I'm now going to go through the cloud flow and show you exactly how I built this solution. So I'll maybe look at the history first, and then I can run through the build. So I actually have a series of parameters which I've stored here in an array. So you can see I have a pair of keys and values of department, which is the keyword that I'm searching for either in the subject or in the file name. And then I have the bespoke path. So it's a pretty basic path. It's literally /finance or /ICT or HR. And it's this array that I use to look up the bespoke path for the keyword that I'm looking for in like I say, the subject or the file name. I'm then going to use the filter array to filter that array based on the subject that's been passed to us. And you can see here that we have in the output the HR has been returned because we've found HR within the subject line that we created. So if we go to my original inbox where I sent my original email, it was for the HR. So there was a subject line, this is for HR. And so the Cloudflow has done a filter on this parameters array and returned the single entry for HR and the path for HR. And then I simply retrieve that path as an output here, which I then pass on to the next stage. So the delays we can ignore. I've put that in purely for the demonstration so I could jump between the different locations. If we look at the create file bespoke path, we can see here that the folder path is the shared documents /HR, and that's based on the path that we picked up here. If I look at creating a file in the bespoke site, we've got the site address as sites /HR, and the default folder path is shared documents. And then if I look at the final example, which is save based on attachment name, you'll note that the logic is slightly different here. I've gone for an apply to each, and this will make more sense when I go through the flow in more detail. But as before, I do a filter on, instead of the subject line, I'm now doing it on the file name, and you can see that again the same input, the array from above, the parameters array, and this time I've returned the ICT department and path, because based on the file name we had the word ICT or the string ICT. And if we have a look at the create file bespoke path based on the attachment name, you can see here that within the folder path, we have /ICT. So I'll jump into the edit of the Cloudflow and see the nitty gritty now, how it all comes together. So we've covered the trigger already, and I've limited how the trigger is launched using these various parameters, and I would seriously suggest that you consider using the parameters here to limit the number of occasions that your Cloudflow runs. The parameters, like I said before, if we can get it to open, is based on an array. So I've simply defined the keyword, which is the department, and then the path. Now, in my 3 examples, I've saved to either a folder or a site, but equally, you could have a path for a site and then a path for a folder as well. So you could combine the two and actually create a third set of key values for each of the elements here within the array, so that you can make it even more configurable. Now, whilst I've used an array here as an option for configuring these options, you could, in theory, use something like a SharePoint list. And then based on getting the items from the list, it will return an array, and you would, for instance, have a column called department, a column called path, and the rest of the flow would be very much the same. I chose this route just because it allows me to configure everything within the single Cloudflow. Looking at the filter find path, we take the output of the parameters above. So we're looking at the array that we've created above, and we're filtering on the subject. So does the subject contain the department? And because this is a filter, it will go through every single item within that array and look for ones that match. Now, of course, if we had a subject that had the words HR and ICT, then we'd have 2 matches. But what I've assumed here is we'll always only have 1. And you'll see them in the next part of my flow where I've got a select action, or a compose action, sorry, not a select, a compose action. I'm using the expression first. And the reason for me using the expression first here is because I want to only return the first element of that array. So a Cloudflow will expect there to be multiple elements returned in an array, and that's why you'll see in a Cloudflow it automatically putting you into an apply to each. If you use the expression first, then you can select that first element of the array. And like I said earlier, I'm assuming that there'll only ever be 1 match, and I just want to get that first path. So based on the first match within that filter, I will get just that path. So if we now look at the create file with a bespoke path, as you do normally, I've selected the site address. So you can see here my new site. But for folder path, what I've done here is I've put in, using the dynamic content, I've typed in shared documents, and then using the output from the path above, I am creating this dynamic string based on the filter. And so when we get a match with ICT, we'll get /ICT. If we get a match with finance, we'll get /finance, and so on. And that's how we build up our bespoke folder path. For the file name, again, to avoid getting into an apply to each, and you'll see the alternative option, or the default option, when I progress through this flow. The third option, I've gone with the default apply to each. Nothing wrong with that situation, but I just like to try and keep things tidy. I've used here within the expression, you can see the integer reference to the first element. So elements start from number 0, and you might see an error message if you're trying to select an element within an array. Sometimes it will say you need to use the integer in order to select elements. This is what it's referring to. So I'm simplifying things here by using the number 0. Equally, as I did on the path, you can use the expression first. It's the same Same output, it's just one of two different ways of retrieving the first element of that array. And so this will return the name, which is the file name based on the trigger outputs, which is our trigger for when an email is received. And that will simply grab the file name and put it into the file name parameter. Just very much like the file name, again, I'm using that integer 0 to select the first element, and this time I'm selecting the content bytes. And again, that just allows me to grab the file content for that single attachment. I've made an assumption there's only ever going to be one attachment, but equally you can accept that default build that will put your create file into and apply to each. And if there's one attachment, it'll run one time. If there's three, it'll run 3 times. But for this particular example, it'll only ever run for the first file attachment. So the create file bespoke site is very much like the path. The only difference this time is instead of having the output for the path at the end of the folder path, it's now at the end of the site address. And so one of the things you might experience when building this is the Cloudflow will attempt to resolve the URL. So one of the important things to do, if I just select this string here, one of the important things to do when building this is to make sure that you scroll down to the bottom here and select enter custom value. If you don't do that, you're going to be fighting with Power Automate trying to resolve the URL that you're typing in. So I can paste back in the string, which is for sites, and then if I jump onto the dynamic content and just scroll through the options here, I can pick path, and there you go. That keeps that particular action happy. And the folder path is just the default shared documents. But equally, if you went for the option of combining a third key value, you could have a bespoke folder path as well for this particular solution. And just like the above option, I'm just using the same expressions for picking the file name and the file content based on one attachment. So let's have a look at the third solution now, saving a file based on attachment name rather than the email subject. So you can see here, this is an apply to each. So this is what I was trying to explain earlier. If you try and drop in the attachment name or attachment contents into the create file, it'll automatically drop you into an apply to each. And the reason it does that, like I explained earlier, the results from the attachment name and attachment content are in an array. There could be multiple attachments, so it automatically assumes that it needs to go into an apply to each. In my above solution, I limited that by using the first expression or the integer selection for that for a single element. But here I've accepted the default content, which is based on there being multiple attachments and multiple content. So similar to the filter we had before, rather than filtering on the subject line, I'm now filtering on the attachment's name. So I'm using the parameters from the initial array that I've created, and I'm now filtering on the attachment name. So the attachment name, we're looking for, does it contain the word department? And again, we're using the item department from the output above. And so the hope is that will return one result. And that's why when we look at the create file bespoke path attachment name, I'm using the expression first. And as before, appending that onto the end. So it's pretty much the same solution, but using a different string to search for that keyword department. And that's what builds our solution. At the very end of my flow, I have got the option to delete the email. That was to try and keep things nice and tidy. I know that once I've processed the attachments from my email, I delete the email, the attachments have been saved, and there's no more need for me to keep that email. If any of these stages fail, we won't get down to the bottom of the delete email. Equally, if we don't get a match on the subject line, again, we won't get a path, which will result in these stages failing. So you could argue that we could improve some of the logic here and have some exception handling so that if we do end up with a subject line or a file name that doesn't contain our keyword, we have a default path that we save the file to, or we alert the original sender or maybe an administrator for the office that a file hasn't been able to automatically save to a folder or a site. But if you think about this, you've got a Xerox workstation. Instead of checking your mailbox for all these attachments and filing them into the right place, you now have a Cloudflow that can do this for you, saving you so much time. And what more can you ask for? So I hope you've enjoyed that demonstration. I hope you give it a go. If you've got any questions, wondering how you can extend this functionality, give me a shout, leave me a comment below. And as always, please make sure that you like and subscribe. And thanks very much for watching.